Hi guys, it's Lucy. This week I wanted to share one short and sweet story that I finished reading last week and three books that I'm actually in the middle of simultaneously. So the one that I finished is called Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. I picked this one up, the mass paperback version, right before going on vacation, and it is 450-ish pages, but this blew by really fast. Neil Gaiman is one of the authors that I really rely on to fill my mind with a fantasy story that's completely different from where I am and whatever I'm doing. And it is a very fast read. This is something that started out as a BBC children's series, and he actually rewrote this. The original was published, I think, in 1996, and the American version 97, but this was rewritten and it was republished in 2000, and then he redid this again, so this is the latest version from 2015. I don't care for this cover, but it is one of those stories set in London, and there is a parallel universe. There is a young guy working in finance, quite boring really, but he falls into this other London, and there's this whole hero journey and coming of age story. Single timeline, single narrator, main character, and it's quite a nice journey just to delve into for a little bit of your life. Neil Gaiman stories, I tend to parse out and don't read them all. I think that last one I read was American Gods from, not sure when it was published, but it was before the TV series came out. That was when I got interested in the story and saw it in the bookstore. I read that one maybe 2 years ago, so I really recommend that as well. I think American Gods is probably more fitted for a slightly older audience, perhaps middle school age at least, because I think there is a sacrificial murder involved, and that is a topic I think is a little bit heavy and quite different than something lighter like Neverwhere, which, started out originally as a children's show to begin with. The first half-read book I wanted to introduce to you is this one, Picture of Dorian Gray, by Oscar Wilde. And of course, for everybody, this probably doesn't need any introduction at all. I think there's a reason why I tend to stop in the middle of classics more often than any other type of books. And it's because really good fiction for me tends to stay with me longer, either the characters or just the overall story itself. And one of the reasons is that it feels very dense and rich, either in the way that the narrative is written, or the style, or the plot lines. There's more interesting things going on, and sometimes I need a bit more time to absorb it. So for me, I did not quite realize the difference between the backdrop of being like a perfect portrait of a young man who is just shiny and young and coming out in the world, versus the other side of this actual man who, keeping his picture pristine in a locked attic room, and goes about doing all kinds of horrible things. I mean, I think being a very representative novel written by a very famous author, this is one of his most well-known works. And reading it, I can feel that he put a lot of himself in this book. And I know that's a hard statement to make because I don't know him, and I've only read half of the book, but it's just one of those things that you just keep reading and stopping and reading and stopping, so that I put this book down, I think maybe about a month and a half ago, and I will go back to it, but I think when I do, I will probably reread from the beginning just to get the most enjoyment out of this, and perhaps flip back to it later on after I finish as well. It's a very, very novel idea for the story itself, and there are snippets here and there of the author's own personal made-up or real philosophy, I'm not sure, injected into this, that makes it not just a very good story, but a very good work of fiction. So the second half-read book is Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel, or Mantel. This is the first book of the 3-book series that I think the last book just came out, like Mirror, something like that. This book, I had to stop in the middle. So it talks about Thomas Cromwell, who is, I think he ended up an earl, but he wasn't born into the title, which in itself is a very fascinating thing. And the time in history in which this is set, Henry VIII, the one with the many wives, and the time when England was splitting from Catholicism, it makes for a very rich setting and a very juicy story, obviously. But the reason I felt compelled to stop, it was at a time when Thomas Cromwell, his master, the cardinal, had died. And not just died of, natural illness, whatever, but he was kind of forced off of the political stage by his, enemies or adversaries in court. And I feel like it was a huge betrayal, at least in the way that this was portrayed, and perhaps in historical context as well, that he kind of lost in that sense. And Thomas Cromwell, this book, being written from his perspective, is extremely dense, and he's portrayed as someone with an extremely high EQ in the way that he is recounting all of his conversations and discussions of his affairs, the cardinal's affairs, the king's affairs. He just climbs the ladder like nobody else in any other book that I've read. So it's all of this scheming, and you could call it scheming, you could call it, just living, maybe just for him as a character, but it's fascinating everything that goes on that is in his brain narrated. So the density of this work, I think, is why it received such low reviews compared to the other two. The other 2 books later in the series actually received higher reviews, and I think it's because the people who stuck with the first book and really enjoyed the first book got used to the tempo and the complexity of the story and the writing. The author does such a great job with this that it reads more like a screenplay with commentary. So not just the explicit recounting of affairs and narrative pushing on the plot, but all of the subplots that goes on that this one character is watching for all by himself and making the most out of it for himself. I think I've had enough of Thomas Cromwell for about a month, so I might go back to this after I finish reading perhaps the third one, which I half read again, and I'm still in the middle of reading. And the third book I'm talking about is The Warmth of Other Suns, and the author is Isabel Wilkerson. So this book I picked up, you could say, for Black History Month, but I don't particularly follow themes when I'm reading. It was just that I got so sick of Thomas Cromwell that I really wanted to jump to something that I was also very interested in. Isabel Wilkerson came on my radar about a year or 2 ago when she published her second book, Cased. So that one is still in hardcover, and I think the paperback version might be coming out next year. I watched some of her interviews, and she is such a polished, well-spoken person that, and the way that the scale of her work, the ambition of her work, both of her works, was really what caught my attention. And The Warmth of Other Suns is her first work, and it is a nonfiction. It covers the Great Migration, which is following the slaves in the American South migrating to other parts of America over, I guess, the bulk of the 20th century, essentially. And she, I think in here, and she lists some of her sources in the back, there's just lists of names. There were over 1,200 people interviewed for this story, and that's why I think it is so ambitious to begin with, because there's no other book that I've come across that tries to tell the story of an entire culture or subculture of people. And the fact that She is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and a professor at places like Princeton and Emory and lecturer at Harvard. You could really see that coming off of her interviews and also in her work as well. I was very interested in reading The Warmth of Other Suns before her second book because I feel the acclaim and also just the grandiosity of reading The Great Migration before The Case, which is, I would say it's a more special, I think it goes into more of Jim Crow, of how that system itself works in the South specifically, versus The Migration covers the entire country and the background of all of the drivers behind that, and it would give the second work a lot more context. So having read about a third of this book, I'm very, very happy that I started reading this, and I wish I picked it up last year when I first came across it. So this is something that I would really recommend to everyone. I think it should really be on, it's an educational book, and I feel like this is something that should be on book lists of educators for everyone to read. This is, in my books, an essential to understand today's culture and context, and I've learned a lot of things through these personal stories, and it's like, it really reads like 1,200 people in one voice, which is quite something in itself. So that's everything that I am chewing through and have been on my mind the past week or so. I'll keep you guys updated on my progress and any new books that I'm reading and have finished. I hope you guys have a good reading week ahead as well. Bye.